Welcome back, everyone, to Lost Shrine. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the dark, rain-soaked woods of Appalachia, where the shadows hide encounters that are as chilling as they are true. In today's episode, I'll be sharing 8 shocking real-life camping encounters, stories that will make you think twice before setting up your tent in the forest. Each tale blends the eerie silence of the wilderness with spine-tingling moments that stayed with those who lived through them. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this with anyone brave enough to hear these stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Now, let's step into the darkness. The first night I ever went alone into the high spruces above Bryson City, I told myself it would be a kind of cleansing. I'd been carrying the city in my bones for months. Dead-end shifts, quiet arguments over things that weren't worth the words, a woman who left with a duffel and a look that cut deeper than anything else. And when the map showed that ridge where the trees crowd like old men shoulder to shoulder, I booked a single night and drove until the road thinned and the headlights only made the rain look more honest. The spruces there grow tight enough to feel like a wall. You step into them, the world behind you snaps shut. I liked the idea of being wrapped in something older than me, something that didn't take what I had and measure it against what it wanted. Rain came slow at first, a silver mist on the wind, then harder, finally battering the canopy so hard it sounded like gravel being poured through a throat. I set my tent under a forked spruce where the branches made a crude shield, huddled with my stove and my thermos and a cheap paperback I'd never read through. The wind hummed in the needles. The rain made the world small and repetitive and safe. At least, that was how I tricked myself into sleep. I woke once to the sound of footsteps that weren't mine. At first, I thought I dreamed it. Dreams clump around real things and try to pass for them. It was the odd little scrape of something soft on softer moss, quick and then gone. I listened, half asleep, counting the seconds because the forest does numbers differently, 30, 60, 90. And then the rain drowned out my pulse, and I slipped back toward the thin remainder of rest I had. Later, around 11, the thing that woke me properly was light. A flashlight beam cut through the trunks like an accusation, fast and shaky, as though someone was searching for something they'd lost. The first time I saw it, I pulled the rainfly tighter to my face and stayed still, the way you stay still when you know something in those woods can hear you breathing. For a second I thought, ranger, a lost hiker, someone with a bad flashlight and a better reason to be awake than I had. The beam was the kind you'd mistake for someone holding it at arm's length, only it didn't move the way an arm moves. It stayed at the same height, level, and unbending, which is a small thing to notice until you realize how human movement works. A wrist, a shoulder, a breath. This light had none of that. It jerked left, jerking like something on a hinge. It swung right. Each movement was abrupt, no slow sweep, more like a headlight flicking between trees. Every few minutes it would stop dead the moment I stuck my head out of the tent, like a person who had misread my presence and frozen in embarrassment. But when I called out, my voice thin and more polite than it felt, the light blinked twice and vanished the way you cup your hand over a candle. That was the part that crawled under my skin, the deliberateness. Whatever held that beam knew when I was watching. It knew how to answer in small code. I told myself 100 sensible things. I told myself it was someone setting up a trap for illegal hunters, someone with a rifle and a mind to keep trespassers out. I told myself it was children with a cap and a headlamp playing at a terrible game. Stories braid around fear to make it livable, and for a while I believed whichever one I chose. But the beam kept returning, and each time it moved with a cadence I couldn't place. It would swing between trunks, left, right, left, and then it would pause, focusing on a single point as if whatever it looked at had the power to stop a human heart. Once, it stopped and hung over a patch of moss with a kind of hunger that made me want to crawl like a baby into my sleeping bag and pull the safety rope of light around me. The second time it went off with a small double blink, a sound came from beyond the trees that I couldn't fit into a tidy category. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't a howl. It was more like a long, wet gasp, a sound made when someone tries to move too many things at once, air and memory and muscle, through a throat that remembers only older songs. I sat up, every hair on my arms aligned like little compass needles, and listened as the sound faded into the rain. The forest kept its own counsel. The beam quit for a long stretch after that, and I convinced myself I slept because I woke at 2 in the morning with a faint glow of panic beneath my skin. When the light returned at 2, it was different. It was inches from the ground, sweeping back and forth like someone trying to see under a bed. It was not searching anymore. It was scanning. I could tell by the angle that it wasn't being held upright. It moved in a lower, more methodical plane, sticking to the floor of the forest where roots and moss and small bones lay hidden. It passed under the spruce limbs, over the trunk's knuckles, and every few sweeps it hesitated like something was paying attention to what the beam revealed. The sound that accompanied it, if you could call it that, was a soft, patient rustling, as if deliberate care were being taken to avoid making prints in the mud. That's what gets in your head. You know what prints are. You know how people and tires and dogs leave marks. And the forest is an honest witness to such things, but the ground under that light remained oddly intact, while the moss behind the spruces was crushed as if whatever had passed there had been weightless and then suddenly heavy. The path the crushed moss made led straight toward my tent and stopped dead, at the edge of my vestibule, exactly where the flashlight had pointed the first time I saw it. I unzipped the tent the way you crack a door when you're not sure who's on the other side. The rain had slowed to a steady drumming. The world smelled like green things and iron. I had a headlamp on my forehead, a weak thing that looked laughable against the beam that had been out there, so I left it off and used the glow of my phone for a few hesitant seconds. You don't stand where you've left a fire, not when you want to keep the future. I crouched and made myself small, listening for anything besides rain. The cracking of twig, the slide of a shoe, a breath that didn't belong to a tree. The crushed moss looked fresh, compressed into narrow, spoiling furrows, as if someone had knelt and then crawled forward on all fours. There were no regular footprints stamped into the earth, no tire ruts suggesting a truck or ATV. The moss behind the spruces was flattened in a single conscientious strip, like someone had taken a broom to it. It stopped where the flashlight had pointed the first time. I felt the taste of iron in my mouth, like a promise. I tell you this in the blunt way it happened, because the truth of it is what makes the rest inevitable. I went out with a folding saw and a thick stick because I needed to believe I was not ridiculous. The saw was lighter than it looked. The stick made a clean sound when I tapped a tree with it, which is its own kind of reassurance. I moved in nothing but the rain and the steady hum of the forest, feeling like a man who had forgotten to lock a door behind him and then remembered after the house was already empty. The light was not visible from where I stood near the tent. It had withdrawn into the scrub like a thing taking cover. I followed the crushed moss because it was the only honest trail I had. You follow trails in the woods the way you follow good habits, without much thought, because the mind will invent reasons for what it cannot see. The trail wove through the spruces and then narrowed toward a low granite outcrop where dates of weather and the deaths of birds are recorded in lichen. There, the crushed line stopped at a clump of roots as though the traveler had paused to take stock. Moss had been scraped away from a surface the size of a boot sole, but there were no boot impressions there, only the suggestion of something having been braced and then dragged. I knelt beside it, and my palms got cold. There, pressed into the wet earth like a child's afterthought, were 4 shallow impressions, no bigger than a grown man's palm and set in a line that suggested knuckles and the arch of a hand. The spaces between them were too close for a normal stride. They ended as if someone had kept their hands on the ground and brought their feet forward beneath them. I did what a bad movie would tell you not to do. I followed them. People who tell you not to look are the same people who never had to be the one who looked. The impressions led to a low tunnel of spruce roots and fallen branches, and under that tunnel, my light found shallow scrapes that had been dragged through the needles. I could have turned back. I know that now with a clean advantage of hindsight, but at the time there was a small, burning insistence inside me. Call it curiosity. Call it the desire to prove that nothing untoward existed in a world that had been making strange, precise sounds all night. I crawled through because the forest was asking me to see, and because the part of me that had lived in kitchens and office cubicles for too long wanted to feel something real and sharp. The tunnel opened onto a small clearing, no wider than my living room, ringed by saplings and the hug of spruce. In the middle of the clearing lay a pallet of old boards, roughly assembled into a crude platform, and on that platform were things arranged the way someone arranges their life when no one is looking. A rusted tin can with a small coil of wire inside, a bundle of mismatched rags wrapped around a smooth stone, a length of rope frayed like the end of a song. Everything smelled faintly of smoke. There were marks on the trunk of a spruce, parallel grooves gouged with a dull object until the bark had split and bled a sticky, sweet sap. Someone had carved a line and then stopped, leaving the cut open to the sky. I sat down because my knees unlocked like shutters. The whole thing was less monstrous than you imagine when you're telling yourself horror stories. There was no wide maw of teeth, nothing that looked like the phantom figures the city's late-night shows would have cooked up. This was human, not entirely civilized, but human. Someone who could build, who could keep a tiny, furtive fire and gather tins and rope. The rational part of my brain tried to catalog what I saw. Possible survivalist, possible drifter, possible child, lost in the wrong season. The other part kept telling me that the light I'd seen could have been attached to something low. A wheeled toy, a bicycle, a headlamp worn on a crooked hat. But the light had an unnatural steadiness. The beam's refusal to rise and fall like a human carried a kind of deliberate intent I feared more than anything. I spent what must have been 30 minutes in that clearing, mapping everything into memory, until the rain and the forest and the raw edges of fear braided into a pattern I could not unsee. Then, because I am not the sort of man who enjoys surrendering to every tremor in his limbs, I picked up the rope and the stone and I began to trace the path back to my tent the same way I had come, as a kind of proof to myself that I could. The path I'd been following, the crushed moss and the hand impressions, went back into the spruces and then stopped. It simply stopped 3 yards from the clearing, as if whoever had made the path had jumped or lifted themselves up and vanished into air. There were no larger footprints, no slough of boot, no sign of departure. The forest around the stopping place was pristine, as if nothing had happened there for a long time. When I reached my tent the second time that morning, the first touch of pre-dawn making the rain feel like a promise, the flap was closed as I left it. My stove and thermos were exactly where I'd left them. The vestibule flap had a smear of something on it, a dark line that might have been sap or might have been blood. I didn't want to know which, and I did yet somehow. Inside the tent, the sleeping bag still held the shape where I'd been. There were no footprints in the mud within 50 feet. There were no signs of a truck. Yet the careful, low-level search that my heart performed found the same small things, the ground pressed as if weight had been distributed differently, a small hair caught in a groove of the zipper that was not mine, the faint scent of smoke or something like it. I don't sleep to that day anymore. I tried to make sense of what I saw with the same tools I'd used before. Rational explanations, hypothetical sequences. Maybe it was a hunter with a lamp at the end of a pole, scraping the ground for traps. Maybe it was a child who had made a hideaway and practiced leaving no trace. Maybe it was a man with no feet who moved with his hands. All of those are reasonable. None of them explain the way the beam blinked twice when I called out, the exact code-like response that was not simply light failing but seemed intended. None of them explained the low, patient sweeping close to the earth, as if whatever man or thing had that flashlight was not using it to see the trees, but to see beneath them. I wrote it down, then and there, as a list of items I could defend. Crushed moss leading up to my tent, hand impressions too small for a grown man, a crude platform and tins and rope, the absence of footprints large enough to be a human stride, and the double blink of light in reply to my voice. Those were the facts. What I felt in the hours and weeks afterward was something thicker, an insistence that the person who built the pallet and collected tins was not interested in being seen by someone who arrived with a pack and illegal campsite permit. They were not hostile in the overt, what you see in movies sense. They were careful, and careful is not the same as evil. Carefulness can hold a sort of cruelty in it, because it means someone has rehearsed silence and found beauty in it. I went back once more with a friend who had a radio and the ruin of a decent sense of humor. We searched the clearing and widened the circle until the world made maps of our movements. We found the pallet and the tins and the gouged spruce. Yes, but the hand impressions were gone, erased by rain or trampled by something heavier, or my memory. We found no bedroll, no more rope, no sign of a continued presence. My friend shrugged the weight of the night off with stories about quail and porcupines, and we laughed because there was nothing else to do with a thing that might swallow your reason. The radio picked up nothing but static and a distant police scanner speaking of roads that were miles away. He told me to let it go, to stop painting the world with the dark varnish of what if. He had children and mortgage payments and other sensible things to defend him against superstition. He lectured me like a man who has chosen to be safe by refusing to see. You learn odd things when you refuse to be terrified by the obvious. You learn to watch for subtleties, twigs that seem moved deliberately rather than by wind, lichen stripped from bark in patterns that repeat themselves, and the cadence of a light that answers when you call. You learn, too, that strangers in the woods often wear more than one face. A hunted one, a hunting one, an ancient shy thing that ducks and comes out in the rain. Weeks after the trip, I woke up in the city and smelled smoke so clearly that for a second, my kitchen filled with the cedar slate odor of that clearing, and I understood then that what had followed me was not a memory I could shelve. It was a thing with a rhythm, and rhythm finds ways to be heard if you let your ear soften. Months passed. I told the story to people who asked, because summers in the city require having been somewhere extraordinary. People offered their own readings. Meth head, hermit, a veteran with dislocated answers, a child playing at being feral. Each reading rearranged the fear to suit the listener. None of them asked about the double blink. None of them asked why the light refused to behave like a human wrist. None of them asked why the trail led to my tent and stopped where the beam first landed. One night, a year later, I was driving back from a job interview that had gone poorly, past where the road falls away and the hotel signs thinned down to one blinking blue light. Rain began again, like a pattern stitched into the calendar. I pulled over to the side of the road because I couldn't face another telling of my life. I sat in the dark of the car and let the rain drum its gravel song on the roof, for no good reason other than habit. Like a man who checks a door because he always checks it, I took my phone out and scrolled to an old photograph I had taken the morning after in that clearing. The pallet leaned like a tired promise. The tins were a small, ridiculous economy. The gouged bark looked like someone trying to tally something with a dull blade. In the corner of the photograph, half hidden where the light had fallen, was a narrow smear in the moss. At first I thought it was shadow. Then I saw the suggestion of shapes. 4 small, shallow impressions, placed in a line. I thought then about people who say they have seen things in the dark and wonder how sure you can be about memory. Memory is a poor thing to trust sometimes until it is the only thing you have left. I tucked the phone away. I started the car and drove home. The world did not change. The woman I once loved had a new address. My job changed hands twice. The city grew louder and, in a way, more crowded. But every so often, in rain-heavy nights and rooms where sleep is thin, I think about the steadiness of that flashlight beam, the almost polite double blink, and the way the moss was pressed down to make a line no wider than a secret. I think about how small those hand imprints were and how precisely they ended at the edge of my tent, like a person who had practiced coming close and leaving little trace. I think about how human and how careful the clearing felt, how someone could be sleeping under the stars and yet so adamant about not being found that they would learn to move like the ground itself. If you take anything from this, it is a poor thing. Be wary of places that remember you, even if you want to forget them. The spruces will grow long after you, and the rain will keep a ledger of all the passing things. Sometimes the ledger is literal. Crushed moss, small handprints, a pallet of boards, and a coil of wire. Sometimes the ledger is the soft, impossible knowledge that someone out there has learned the art of moving through the forest without being seen and has reasons to keep that art sharp. I tell it because it keeps the feeling honest and because I would rather be judged for telling the truth than swallowed by the might of beans. On nights when the rain sounds like gravel and the house smells faintly of smoke, I still wake and check the lock on the door. I listen for the steady, slow sweep of a light close to the ground. I've never been comfortable with certainties, and this one I keep like a shard. The beam that blinked twice, the crushed strip of moss leading to me and stopping, the hands placed flat against the earth as if to feel their way forward. I do not know who learned to walk in that way beneath the spruces, nor do I know why they paused where they did. I only know that they practiced the silence until it became a thing you could trust, and they practiced the leaving until it was indistinguishable from absence. Every sound in the night since then has a patience to it, and I find myself listening for pattern rather than for danger. Sometimes that pattern answers back, and it blinks, and the way it blinks makes me think it remembered me. I wasn't planning on spending the night out there. I'd meant for it to be a quick day hike, maybe camp by the ridge if the weather held, but the windstorm rolled in faster than the forecast predicted. The whole sky had shifted by late afternoon, thick, low clouds dragging across the mountains like something heavy was pushing them down. The temperature dropped, and that brittle hush right before the wind ramps up settled along the tree line. I knew I wouldn't make it back before the worst of it hit, so I started looking for a decent spot to ride it out. That's when I found the fallen pines. 3 of them, big ones too, old white pines with long, straight trunks, had been snapped and pushed over by what looked like one violent gust. The crowns were tangled together, branches stripped bare, needles scattered like green confetti all across the trail. But the way they'd fallen created this narrow little tunnel underneath, the kind of space an animal might crawl into during bad weather. It wasn't tall enough to stand in, not even kneel properly, but it blocked the wind beautifully. I'd camped in worse places. The rain was already misting through the trees, smelling like sap and cold soil, that raw earth scent that sticks to your clothes. I didn't waste time. I pitched my tent about 10 feet from the fallen trunks, close enough to benefit from the windbreak, but far enough that nothing heavy would roll on top of me. The ground was soft but not swampy, thick with old pine needles that muffled every step. It felt isolated, quieter than the rest of the trail. Even the birds had gone silent. By the time night came, the storm had fully settled. The wind whistled through the gaps in the canopy, making the pines creak like they were being twisted. Rain hammered against the tent, puddling around the edges. I cooked a quick meal under the vestibule, listening to the forest shift and hiss. I've always found storms kind of comforting, like the noise keeps your thoughts from drifting too far into dark places. Around midnight, the storm hit one of those lulls where the wind dies down but the rain keeps falling in lighter sheets. I was half dozing, barely aware of the sounds anymore, when something new slipped in underneath it. A rustling. not the dry scuttle of a squirrel or the fast agitation of a raccoon. This was slower, steadier, like something shifting its weight carefully, deliberately, so as not to be heard. It came from the area under the fallen pines. At first, I told myself it was just the storm shaking the branches, but the wind wasn't blowing, and the sound had rhythm. Weight, it was too slow to be rain, too heavy to be birds. It almost reminded me of someone adjusting their position on a wooden floor. A slow drag, then stillness, a soft bump, then another drag. My first thought was that an animal had crawled into the shelter to escape the weather. A fox, maybe, or a stray dog from one of the nearby properties. Bears don't move like that. They're bold, noisy, clumsy in their own intimidating way. This was quiet, too quiet. I grabbed my headlamp and unzipped the tent just enough to sweep a beam toward the tangle of trunks. The moment the light hit the shelter, the sound stopped. Not faded out, stopped, as if whatever made it froze completely. I held my breath, aiming the light into that tight, dark wedge of space. The glow bounced off the wet bark, catching on dripping branches, but nothing moved. Nothing even hinted at a movement. After a full minute, I shut off the light, and the rustling started again. This time closer, a scraping against the bark that sounded unmistakably like knees, dragging or elbows shifting for a better angle. Something was crawling deeper beneath the trunks, inching toward the open side, toward me. I told myself, firmly, that it was an animal. I had to. The alternative didn't make sense. People don't crawl into tight, muddy spaces during a storm to lie under trees. People don't hide from a tent light unless they're trying very, very hard not to be seen. The scraping grew softer when I listened too intently, like it could somehow tell. That's the part that unnerved me most. It felt reactive. I backed into my tent and zipped it, even though the thin nylon wouldn't stop anything determined. I lay down and killed my headlamp, thinking maybe the darkness would calm whatever was out there. But as soon as the last sliver of light disappeared, a new sound replaced the scraping. Breathing. Slow, deep, controlled. The kind of breathing someone makes when they're deliberately trying to stay quiet, but not quite quiet enough. It was coming from directly under the pines. I held perfectly still, my sleeping bag pulled to my chin, listening to each inhale and exhale float through the rain. The storm dampened everything except that sound. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Long enough for the rain to shift patterns. Long enough for my legs to go numb. Long enough for doubt to crawl up my spine. There's a moment when fear stops being sharp and becomes heavy. When you're too scared to act, too scared to even think about acting. That's where I was. I didn't dare shine the light again. I didn't dare move. I kept picturing a pair of eyes watching the silhouette of my tent, unblinking, waiting for something. Some cue I didn't want to accidentally give. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, the breathing faded. Not abruptly, like whoever, or whatever, was making it slowly backed away beneath the trunks, inch by inch, until I could no longer tell if it was real or just my heartbeat filling the silence. I never slept, not even for a second. When dawn finally broke, the relief that hit me almost felt like nausea. I waited until light fully settled through the trees, then forced myself out of the tent. The world looked harmless again, pale gold sunlight slicing through the fog, rainwater dripping from needles, steam rising off the ground. Nothing about it suggested the dread that had soaked into me overnight. I walked to the fallen pines. The space underneath was empty. No animal, no person, no bedding, no tracks, nothing disturbed except the ground itself, which was pressed smooth in 2 long indentations. Elbows and knees, arms and legs, the shape of someone lying face down, perfectly still, watching my camp from 10 feet away. The bark right above those spots had been smoothed clean where something had rubbed against it over and over. Not in claw marks or paw scuffs, in the exact width and shape of someone's forearms. Cold washed through me as I stared at the space. It felt wrong, too intentional, too human. Animals don't lie down like that. They don't rest with their elbows tucked beneath them, and they don't disappear without leaving tracks. I packed fast, faster than I ever have. My hands shook so badly I could barely roll up the tent. I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting someone to step out, muddy and silent, like they'd just been waiting for me to come close enough. But I didn't see anything. Not then. The hike back down the trail should have been easy, but the forest felt different, watchful. The deeper I walked, the more the sensation clung to me, this prickling awareness between my shoulder blades. Every time a branch snapped somewhere off the path, I froze. Every time the wind shifted the leaves, I jumped. It felt like I'd woken something, or disturbed something that preferred not to be found. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I noticed something odd. Thin, fresh mud streaks on the trees. Not claw marks, not boot prints either. Smears. Like someone with muddy hands had braced themselves against the trunks while walking, a few feet apart on either side of the trail. Almost like someone had been pacing, waiting. I tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the sound of the stream nearby, on the birds finally breaking the dawn silence, on anything that wasn't the dread crawling tighter around my ribs. But the smudges kept appearing, the whole way down, always around my height, always in pairs, and always damp. By the time the parking lot came into view, I was practically jogging. My heart wouldn't settle. My breathing wouldn't even out. I tossed my gear in the car without checking it, slammed the door, and locked it before starting the engine. But before I drove away, I looked toward the trailhead one last time. A figure stood at the tree line, not moving, not waving, just standing, too still to be casual, too dark to see clearly. The shape was thin, hunched slightly at the shoulders. Mud streaks ran down its arms and legs like it had dragged itself through the forest. I blinked and the branches shifted, obscuring it. When the wind pushed them aside again, the figure was gone. I don't camp alone anymore. Haven't since that night. Something changed in me out there. Some instinct buried deep in the human brain that still knows when it's being hunted. When something is watching you that shouldn't be. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind dies down, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, deliberate breathing in the dark. Like someone lying inches from me. Trying to stay calm, trying not to be heard, trying not to be seen. And every time I think of that space under the fallen pines, smooth, perfect impressions, pressed into the earth where something watched me all night long. Something that didn't want to be found. Something that left no tracks because it didn't need to. Some things in those mountains don't run from the storm. They wait in it. They listen. And if you're unlucky enough to camp too close, they crawl right up beside you, watching, waiting, breathing in the dark. I grew up thinking I understood what the woods could and couldn't do. I'd camped in the Appalachian since I was a kid, long before I had the words to describe the quiet dread that sometimes hangs between the trees. My dad used to say the mountains had their own way of talking, and if you stayed long enough, you learned when to listen and when not to. I didn't really believe him until the night near Lake Toxaway when the rain started tapping rhythms that weren't its own. Even now, years later, I still can't sleep when it rains. Something about that double-hit sound crawls beneath my skin. I'd hiked out there alone, chasing the kind of peace I only get when I'm far enough from everything that cell service and headlights feel like fiction. The sun was dipping behind the ridge when I reached the hollow, a long, gentle sink in the forest floor where rainwater pooled and the air always seemed a few degrees colder. I'd camped around Talks Away plenty of times, but this spot was new to me. It felt strangely sheltered, like the woods were folding in on themselves. I remember standing at the edge of that dip, staring at the darkening leaves below, wondering why every sound in there seemed to echo twice. The weather had been threatening rain all afternoon. You could smell the storm before it reached the ridge. I pitched my tent just above the hollow on a little patch of flat ground. Nothing fancy. Just a tarp slung low over my tent to keep the water from pooling. By the time the first drops started pattering on the tarp, I was already zipped inside, chewing on some trail mix and listening to the night settle in. Rain always soothed me. The smell of it, the steady hiss through the trees, the way it turned the whole forest into one long exhale. At first, that was all I heard. Just rain on the tarp, the occasional drip off a branch, the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the mountains. But after 15, maybe 20 minutes, something felt off. The echoes in the hollow were too sharp, too clear. Every raindrop on the tarp had a second sound to it, like it was being mirrored somewhere deeper in the woods. Normally, echoes smear together, soften, blur. This was clean, precise, a perfect double tap. I tried to brush it off as acoustics. Mountain hollows do weird things with sound, but after a while, I couldn't ignore the timing. The rain hit the tarp, then, after exactly the same spacing, another tap sounded from the dip below. Not a second raindrop, a reply. I remember sitting up suddenly, my heart thumping harder than the rain. I held my breath, listening. Tap, tap, 2 raindrops, 2 echoes. Tap, tap, over and over, perfectly spaced. I told myself it had to be something natural. Maybe the storm was bouncing sound off the far ridge. Maybe the hollow amplified certain patterns. But a part of me, some old instinct I didn't like acknowledging, kept whispering that something was down there, mimicking the rain on purpose. Every raindrop that hit my tarp, something down below was striking a surface of its own, trying to stay in sync. Curiosity eventually got the better of fear. I reached up and gave the tarp 3 sharp taps with my knuckles. I don't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe some random scattering of echo that would prove I was imagining things. But the answer came back immediately. 3 taps, perfectly spaced, perfectly matched. The hair on the back of my neck lifted. That wasn't acoustics. That wasn't weather. Something had to be in the hollow, listening and responding. I hesitated for a long time, barely breathing. Then I tapped 4 times. The woods answered with 4. I didn't know what to do. Adrenaline made everything too loud. The rain, the wind, my heartbeat. My mind kept racing through possibilities. Could it be another camper messing with me? Someone hiding down there? But I hadn't passed a soul in hours, and this hollow was hidden. You wouldn't stumble into it by accident, especially in a storm. I didn't tap again. I didn't want to play whatever game this was turning into. For a while, the woods went silent except for the rain. I gradually convinced myself that the responder, whoever or whatever it was, had lost interest. Maybe it had just been some strange acoustic quirk after all. Then it tapped first. 4 slow knocks, deliberate and spaced far enough apart that they felt like a message rather than a pattern. I froze. The knocks weren't coming from the hollow this time. They sounded closer, higher, maybe halfway up the slope. I didn't react. I didn't even shift my weight. The tarp clung low enough that nothing outside could see me unless it crouched right at the edge of the tent, but knowing that didn't help. I lay there, absolutely still, my pulse rattling in my ears. I kept telling myself not to answer. Don't acknowledge it. Don't give it anything. I think that's what saved me. The next set of knocks came from behind my tent. Not on the tarp, on the ground. A slow, soft rapping, like someone testing the firmness of the soil. I couldn't turn around to see, but I felt the earth shift slightly beneath me, as though something were kneeling in the wet leaves less than a foot away. My breathing went shallow. The rain kept falling steady, masking smaller movements, but every few seconds, I heard that careful tapping, not urgent, not angry, just patient, like it was waiting for a response. When I didn't give one, the tapping stopped. Not because the thing left. I could feel it still, something heavy and unmoving on the other side of the thin nylon wall. It stayed there for what felt like hours. I don't remember falling asleep, only waking in short jolts, terrified I'd moved or made a sound. Every time I opened my eyes to the darkness inside the tent, I'd lie there listening, wondering if I'd hear that deliberate tapping again. But nothing came after those first few minutes. It didn't walk away. It didn't shift. It just existed somewhere behind me, silent and waiting until the sky finally started to lighten. When dawn crept through the trees, the rain had slowed to a thin drizzle. The moment I realized the forest was quiet, really quiet, without the unnatural echo. I unzipped the tent. Every muscle in my body was stiff. I half expected to find someone crouched right behind me, but the space was empty. The leaves were soaked, pressed flat in strange lines and depressions, but there was no figure, no footprints, nothing. I forced myself to stand and look toward the hollow. The forest felt hollowed out in a different way now. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. The smell of the rain was sharp and metallic. On the slope leading into the dip, the leaves had been pushed down in long, even lines, 2 parallel tracks about the width of knees. It looked like someone had knelt there for hours, rocking slightly, maybe adjusting their weight to match the rhythm of the rainfall, but no footprints led to it. None led away from it. The leaves around the depressions were undisturbed. Whoever had been there hadn't walked in. Or walked out. I told myself I was misreading the ground. Maybe water runoff had formed the depressions, maybe branches had fallen. Anything sounded better than the truth rising in my chest. Still, I knew. Deep down, I knew what I'd heard wasn't water, or branches, or echo. Something intelligent had knelt there in the storm, copying the rain to see if I'd notice. I packed fast, convinced the entire time that something was watching me from just out of sight. Every sound made me flinch. The squelch of mud under my boots, the drip of rainwater from the top as I pulled it down, even the wind dragging through the pines. The forest didn't feel empty. It didn't feel like it had returned to normal. It felt expectant. By the time I started up the trail, the drizzle had stopped completely. The air was heavy and still. I'd walked maybe a mile before I let myself look back. The hollow was hidden behind trees and distance, but something in the silence told me it hadn't forgotten me. I didn't camp alone for a long time after that. When I finally did, I stuck to marked campgrounds, places with other people within shouting distance. Even then, I struggled to sleep if it rained. I'd lie awake counting drops, waiting for a second pattern to join in. Most nights, nothing happened, but sometimes, rarely, I'd hear the faintest echo off in the distance, not close enough to panic me, but clear enough that it wasn't imagination. Years passed. The memory faded around the edges, but the fear stayed sharp. I learned to rationalize it. Strange acoustics, exhaustion, overactive nerves in the dark. That's what I told myself. Then, 2 summers ago, I went back to Lake Toxaway with my cousin. He didn't know the story. I didn't want to tell it. We stuck close to the main trails, never straying far from established sites. On the second night, a storm rolled in. Not a big one, just enough rain to make the tarps rattle. We were sitting under the shelter eating dinner when he paused suddenly and tilted his head. "You hear that?" he said. I froze before I could stop myself. "Hear what?" He pointed toward a tree line maybe 50 yards away. "Sounds like someone knocking out there." The blood drained from my face. "It's just rain," I said too quickly. He frowned. No, the rain's hitting the tarp. This is coming from the woods. Same rhythm and everything. He tapped the plastic table beside him. 3 taps. Somewhere in the darkness, from the exact direction of the hollow, even though we weren't camped near it, 3 taps answered. My cousin jerked back, eyes wide. The hell was that? I grabbed his wrist. Don't tap again. Why? Just trust me. He didn't understand, but he listened. We sat there in suffocating silence while the rain fell harder. No more taps came, but I could feel the woods listening, waiting. When we got home, I swore I'd never go back to Toxaway. I kept that promise for a while. Then life got busy, and fear faded the way it always does when you're surrounded by lights and walls and people who've never heard the woods speak. But 4 nights ago, during a storm, I heard it again through my bedroom window. Tap, tap. 2 knocks, spaced perfectly after the raindrops hit the glass. I live in town now. No hollows, no forest slopes. Just houses and asphalt and a yard too small for anything to hide in. It shouldn't be possible. But the sound was real. Not an echo. A reply. Then, just like that night near Toxaway, it tapped first. 4 slow knocks. Not on the window, on my bedroom wall. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The taps didn't come again. The rain kept falling. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. In the morning, there was nothing on the wall. No marks, no dents. Nothing to prove anything had happened at all, but I know what I heard. And I know it wasn't rain. Whatever crouched in that hollow years ago, it learned my rhythm. It recognized me. And I think, no matter where I go, it knows exactly how to find me again. I don't know why I kept telling myself it was a good idea to camp that deep in the hills alone. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was nostalgia. My dad used to take me out to the breaks where the ridge splits open like a giant old scar, saying the land still held stories if you were quiet enough to hear them. He died 5 years back, but every now and then I take the same old roads, pull off at the same forgotten fire roads, and try to feel a piece of him still lingering out there. Most of the time it brings me comfort. This time it didn't. The sky had been threatening rain all evening, gray clouds dragging low like wet wool, but I still sat up where the land dipped into a shallow clearing shaped like a bowl. There was a fire ring someone else had built. Stones stacked carefully, char and ash still in the center. Looked used, but not fresh. Maybe a few days old. The place felt still. Too still in hindsight, but that didn't bother me at first. The forest always goes quiet before rain. I managed to get a fire going despite the drizzle, fed it sticks and bark until it threw enough warmth to push back the chill. I cooked a can of soup, smoked a cigarette, and leaned back against my pack, listening to the soft tapping of drops hitting leaves. Everything sounded normal. Rain, trees shifting, a far-off owl. I was drifting in that half-sleep where the fire crackle becomes part of your dreaming when I heard it. Footsteps, not running, not stumbling, just walking, slow, measured, like someone was taking their time, not caring how loud they were in the mud. I remember the exact sound. That wet squelch, heel first, then the mushy lift as they stepped forward again. At first I thought it was deer. Maybe elk. But deer don't walk like that. They're quick and light. This sounded human. Too human. I sat up fast enough that my sleeping bag rustled loud. The footsteps didn't pause. Whoever it was kept walking straight through the dark edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight, thumb hovering over the switch, but something in me didn't want to turn it on. I couldn't explain it then. I still can't. But the idea of pointing light out into that darkness felt like inviting something closer, like acknowledging it would make it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. So I just watched the area around the fire. The footsteps approached from the east, the sound getting louder, clearer. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10. They passed right beside the fire. Right beside it, and I didn't see a damn thing. No silhouette blocking the glow, no shadow stretching across the wet ground. The rain softened, and the firelight was steady enough that anything should have cast something, but nothing did. The sound moved past me on the other side, the footsteps continuing west toward the trees. Still constant, still slow, still steady, and the strangest part wasn't even that. It was how dead the air felt. No smell of wet clothes, no breath, no presence at all except for those squelching steps, like the footsteps belonged to a body that wasn't completely there. My heart pounded. I kept waiting to hear them fade into the distance. They never did. The sound simply stopped, mid-step, like someone lifted their foot and never put it back down. I sat there, gripping my flashlight until my fingers hurt, listening to the rain come harder, hissing on the fire. The flames sputtered and shrank, struggling against the downpour. Every few minutes I thought I heard something faint, maybe a twig shifting or a soft drag across mud, but I couldn't be sure. The rain swallowed everything. An hour passed, maybe more. The fire finally gave up, dying in a cloud of steam. And then I heard the footsteps again, this time behind me. They weren't moving through the clearing, they were circling it, slow, methodical, over and over. I pictured someone walking the perimeter, tracing a perfect ring around where my fire had been, never stepping inward, never stepping outward. Just circling. Once. Twice. 10 times. 20. I lost count. I sat frozen inside my tent, staring at the fabric glowing faintly from what little light reflected off the wet ground. Every time the footsteps passed behind me, the sound got louder, like the person was leaning in, curving closer with each lap. My mind kept trying to rationalize it. A hunter, maybe. Someone messed up on drugs, or some kid screwing with me. But the steps were too measured, too consistent. You can tell when someone's drunk or high or angry or afraid from how they walk. There was none of that here. Just purpose. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps stopped. Not tapered off, not walked away, just stopped, like the person halted mid-stride. I held my breath. The rain wasn't as heavy anymore. I could hear drips sliding off branches above me. Then I felt something change in the air outside my tent. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear cloth or skin shift, but someone tall was standing inches from me, so close I swear I felt a pressure pushing against the thin fabric. My whole body tensed. The earth beneath me had gone muddy, and I could sense weight shifting through it. Slow, subtle, like someone was swaying lightly from side to side, like they were thinking, considering. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that the fear was making me interpret every sound wrong. But something was there. I knew it. Every instinct in me tightened at once. If I breathed too loud, whatever it was might react. So I didn't breathe. Minutes passed. 10. 15. My chest started to burn. I had to take shallow sips of air through my nose. The shifting outside continued, that tiny movement of weight, heel to toe to heel. The ground felt soft enough that whoever stood there should have sunk deep into it. Then, as gradually as it had come, that pressure lifted. The presence drew back. I waited to hear footsteps retreating into the woods. I heard nothing. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into an uneasy, terrified sort of sleep. When I woke at dawn, gray light washed over everything and the rain had stopped. Mist hung low between the trees. I crawled out of the tent slowly, skin crawling with leftover dread, and saw the clearing clearly for the first time. Around my fire pit, the one someone else had used, the one I'd used after them, was a perfect ring of footprints. Bare footprints, wide, flat, evenly spaced, each one the same distance from the center, like whoever made them had walked a track carved into the earth. Some prints were deeper than others, like the walker had repeated the circle dozens of times. But there was something far worse. The footprints didn't lead in or out. There were no tracks approaching from the trees or leaving toward them. The ring just existed, isolated, as if the person appeared there and vanished the same way. I crouched down and ran my fingers through one of the prints. The soil wasn't just pressed down. It was compacted, almost packed, too firm for someone walking barefoot in mud, and the shape wasn't quite right. The toes were longer than they should have been, almost finger-like, but the ball of the foot was wide, human-wide, no arch at all. Something about the arrangement made me feel sick, like whoever made the prints wasn't walking in circles but marking something, measuring something, claiming something. The forest felt wrong that morning. No birds, no wind. Even the usual hum of insects was missing. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. I packed fast, didn't even eat. My hands shook the entire time. I could barely fit my gear back into my bag. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone watching. Nothing moved, nothing shifted. I didn't hear anything until I took down the tent. That's when a sound drifted from somewhere beyond the trees. A single, soft step, just one, like someone testing the ground. I froze. The sound didn't repeat, but the air felt charged again. That same pressure, that same sense of height nearby. I didn't bother folding anything after that. I shoved the tent into my pack, grabbed the rest of my gear, and left the clearing as fast as I could without looking like I was running. The entire hike back to the car was a blur. I kept expecting those footsteps behind me, waiting for that slow, steady pace to return, but the forest stayed silent, too silent. Even my own breathing sounded loud in that stillness. The strangest part happened when I reached the gravel road where my car was parked. The mud on my boots should have tracked all the way from camp. It didn't. At some point during the hike, the wet clay coating my boots had fallen away cleanly, almost surgically, like something had scraped it off in one smooth pull. I checked for prints behind me on the road. There were none. Not mine. Not anyone else's. Just untouched gravel. I drove away faster than I should have on those turns, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. Whatever walked around my camp didn't leave tracks the way a person should. It didn't show itself when it passed within feet of my fire. It didn't breathe when it leaned close to my tent, and the footsteps I'd heard so clearly. They weren't footsteps anymore in my memory. They sounded like something imitating footsteps, something trying to mimic the sound of walking, something marking the ground in a circle around me, deciding whether I belonged there or not. I haven't camped alone since. I don't know if I ever will. Some nights, though, usually when rain is just starting, tapping soft against the gutters, I wake up to that same slow, steady sound echoing in my head. Squelch, lift, step. And I swear, just for a second, I can feel that same presence standing outside my door, weight shifting, heel to toe to heel, waiting for something I still don't understand. Sometimes I stay awake until morning, listening, remembering that perfect ring of footprints around my fire. Footprints that began nowhere and ended nowhere. And I keep wondering, if I'd opened the tent at 3 a.m., if I'd unzipped it and looked straight out into the darkness, what shape would have been waiting for me? I've been hiking in the Appalachians for years, chasing a quiet most people don't understand. Not the quiet of a campground or a back road with the occasional car, but the kind of stillness that makes the forest feel alive, like it's aware of every step you take. That weekend, I decided to push farther than usual, taking a ridge trail above Boone I'd heard of but never followed. It wasn't on most maps, just a thin line scratched along a steep crest, surrounded by hollows that fell away into fog so thick you could lose yourself in it, and never know which way was down. I wanted isolation. I wanted the kind of silence that makes your thoughts echo. I wanted to feel the mountains remember me. The hike started in the early afternoon under a slate-gray sky. Rain had been steady, soft but persistent, soaking the leaves and turning the dirt to slick clay. I wore my rain jacket, boots already heavy with mud from the lower trails. The mist began climbing with me as I ascended, curling along the ridge like it was alive, pressing against my skin, hiding hollows and rocks beneath a soft gray veil. I moved slowly, careful with every step, listening to the water dripping from branches, the subtle snap of twigs beneath my boots, and the occasional cry of a bird that sounded far too lonely for its own good. I found a ledge that was barely wide enough for my tent. A few spindly pines leaned in, their needles dripping with rain, shadows stretching long in the dim light. I set up camp quickly, knowing the storm might return, and cooked a small dinner on my stove. The smell of wet pine and earth mixed with the smoke from the burner, filling the tiny clearing. Around me, the forest was unnaturally still. I thought at first it was just the rain, but it felt different, heavier, patient, like the mist itself was holding its breath. By the time I crawled into my tent, the sun had already faded, leaving a gray, suffocating darkness. The rain slowed to a soft patter, then almost stopped, leaving the forest damp, smelling of wet moss and leaves. I was tired, and I drifted into sleep quickly as the sound of dripping water mingling with the wind in the trees. Then, around 1:30 in the morning, I woke. At first, it was subtle. A note, faint, almost like a wind chime. But it wasn't the wind. It had a shape, a tone, a hum, female, fragile, uncertain, repeating the same notes over and over. It was high and trembling, a delicate melody that seemed stitched into the mist itself. My heart thumped as I tried to convince myself it was a nearby creek or a bird still calling at night. But the notes were too deliberate, too human. I unzipped the tent carefully, trying not to make a sound. The fog had thickened, rolling over the ridge like a liquid wall. The trees leaned in and out of it, shadows moving with no wind, like they were breathing in rhythm with the hum. I called out softly, "Hello?" My voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the mist, and for a moment I thought the sound had stopped. But it didn't. The humming persisted, constant and steady, like it had no source. I stepped fully out of the tent, boots sinking into mud that smelled of wet leaves and cold earth. I tried walking toward the sound. Every direction I chose, it stayed the same. Never closer, never farther. It wasn't carried by the wind. It wasn't coming from a tree or a hollow. It existed in the fog, always hovering just beyond reach. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. Someone camping nearby, an echo trick, my imagination. Nothing fit. The voice, or whatever it was, responded to the world in a way that seemed almost intelligent. Then it shifted, slowly, deliberately, behind me. I froze, heart hammering. The fog swirled around me, hiding everything beyond a few feet. I spun, expecting someone, anyone, but the ridge was empty. The sound had moved, but there were no footprints, no movement, nothing but the thick gray air. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming to run back to the tent, but I didn't dare. The fog was too thick, the ridge too narrow, and the humming. It seemed alive, aware of me. I whispered, almost pleading, "Where are you?" For a moment, nothing. Silence heavier than the fog pressed in around me. Then a whisper returned. Not the melody, not the hum, but my exact words. "Where are you?" In my own tone, carried from the trail I had just used to climb the ridge. I stumbled back toward my tent, nearly tripping over roots and rocks, a cold sweat slicking my arms. My mind raced. Someone was out here. Someone or something that could mimic me. Inside the tent, I zipped it closed and sank to the floor, trying to steady my breathing. The hum returned almost immediately, drifting outside, weaving around my camp, impossible to locate. I could feel a pull toward it, a gravity, a compulsion to move, though every fiber screamed to stay put. I pressed my hands to my ears, rocked slightly, told myself it was nothing, told myself I was imagining it, but the dread in my chest refused to relent. Hours passed. The mist clung, heavy and tangible. My flashlight cut a narrow circle of white through the fog, illuminating nothing. The humming pulsed in and out, faint, deliberate, intelligent. I tried counting, focusing on my breathing, imagining the sun rising, anything to distract myself. But it wasn't enough. The sense of being watched never left, never faltered. I imagined a figure, hunched or swaying just beyond the mist, learning me, tracing me, waiting. My mind clung to rational explanations, an old hermit, a lost hiker, but nothing matched the sound, the way it had copied my voice, the impossible presence. When dawn came, it was slow. The mist lifted just enough for shapes to become visible, for the ridge to resume ordinary geometry. Trees, rocks, mud, nothing threatening. The humming was gone, and I stepped out cautiously, boots sinking in wet soil. And then I saw it. A single track in, the mud impossibly long and thin, dragging, swaying. Not a footprint, not a boot, just the impression of a toe that had lingered, perhaps oscillating in place before disappearing. I stared, stomach tight, breathing shallow. Evidence that I hadn't imagined it. I packed quickly, shaking, eyes darting over every shadow, listening to every sound. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every bird, every dripping branch, a reminder that something had been here and I had never seen it. I kept to the trail, descending fast, unsteady in the mud, not daring to look into hollows or fog patches. By the time I reached a wider, sunny part of the forest, rationality had returned in part. Perhaps it had been a trick of acoustics or a combination of fog, exhaustion, and my own imagination. But the track remained in my mind, a silent, undeniable proof. Even back in Boone, it lingered. I told a few friends about it. They laughed, said I'd been scared, alone and tired. But I know what I heard, I know what I felt, and it stayed with me. Years later, I hear faint humming in other ridges, and my mind jumps back to that night. The fog, the ridge, the sound that had nowhere to come from and yet existed, the track in the mud that made no sense. The more I think about it, the more I remember the little things I ignored at the time. The smell of wet moss clinging to the trees, the faint drag of leaves along the ground that weren't caused by wind, the way branches bent in shapes that almost looked like human figures, the low sound of water dripping from leaves into puddles that sounded like soft footsteps. I remember how cold my hands were despite the jacket, how my heart refused to slow, how the mist pressed against my tent like it had weight. I think about the voice most of all, the way it hummed, not singing, not loud, just a fragile, tentative set of notes repeated endlessly. And then the way it copied me, my own words whispered back to me from the trail I'd just climbed. I don't know what it was capable of, what it was learning. I don't want to know. I tried to explain it logically. Could it have been a bird? Impossible. Could it have been some hermit, some prankster? Also impossible. There was no movement, no footsteps, nothing. Could it have been my own mind playing tricks? Maybe. But the track, the drag of a toe in the mud, is something I will never forget. No matter how much I try to rationalize it, my mind always returns to the same conclusion. Whatever it was there. It knew me. It was patient, and it had the entire night to study me. Sometimes, when I hike in heavy fog, I hear it again, or I think I do. The faint, repeating notes drifting through the trees. I don't stop. I don't try to find it. But the pull is there, always, and I know the mountains remember me. Some ridges, some hollows, respond when you speak. And sometimes, the answer comes back in your own voice. Even now, I feel the memory of that ridge, of the fog, of the humming. I can recall every detail, the exact way the mist curled around the pines, the smell of wet leaves, the cold heaviness of the night. I can remember the track in the mud, impossibly long, impossibly deliberate, the way it swayed as if the thing that made it had lingered, studying me. And every time the fog rolls across a hollow, I feel it again, the weight of it pressing against me, the echo of my own voice whispered from somewhere unreachable. I will never walk that ridge again. Not because of mud, not because of rain, not even because of fear in the usual sense. I will never return because I know now the mountains are not empty. They listen, they answer, and sometimes the answer is closer than you think, swaying in the fog, waiting. No one else needs to know. They won't understand, but I hear it still, in the back of my mind, faint as memory, repeating endlessly, and I know, with absolute certainty, that whatever it was, it is still out there, and it is still learning. I've always liked camping alone. There's a kind of clarity in it, a sharpness that cuts through the noise of life, something you never get in the city. No cars, no televisions, no neighbors arguing or dogs barking. Just you, the wind, and the forest. People tell stories about these woods, about strange happenings, about people who vanish without a trace, but I've always thought of it as superstition. Fear sells. That night, though, outside Norton, changed the way I see the world forever. I still wake sometimes, years later, convinced I can hear mud squishing under heavy, deliberate feet, a rhythm that refuses to let me sleep. I had chosen the trail for its isolation. It was narrow, barely more than a deer path, flanked by thick undergrowth that made the forest feel like a cathedral. The locals avoid it after dark, saying it floods easily, that heavy rains can turn it into a river, that people sometimes vanish and are never found. I didn't care. I liked the solitude. I liked the smell of wet pine, the mud squishing under my boots, the sound of leaves collapsing under the rain. That night, the storm rolled in fast, sudden, as if the sky had ripped open. Within minutes, the path was nothing but sticky mud. Every step sank deep, and the wind whipped rain into my face so sharply it stung. The air was thick, the smell of wet earth and something metallic lingering faintly behind it, a coppery tang I couldn't place. I set up my tent near the edge of the trail, careful to avoid roots that might trip me, close enough to watch deer tracks and raccoon prints, far enough to feel hidden. I built a small fire, which the rain quickly tried to steal, flickering and hissing with every gust of wind. I ate quickly, cleaned up my area, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the storm intensified. The rain wasn't just falling, it was hammering. The wind twisted through the trees, bending trunks, rattling leaves, rattling me awake every few minutes. The forest felt alive, not in a friendly way, but the way a predator feels alive, every branch and puddle a part of it. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was the rain moving differently against the mud, the way the wind made puddles ripple. But then I realized it had a rhythm. Heavy, wet steps dragging through the mud, one step, then another, each accompanied by a deep suction sound, like the earth itself was unwilling to let go. I tried to tell myself it was a hunter lost in the storm, but the pace, the cadence, didn't feel human. Hunters move with purpose. They stride, adjust quickly. This was deliberate, measured, slow, as if whoever it was testing the ground, testing me. I froze. My heart pounded, my lungs tight. The steps stopped directly outside my tent. I could hear weight shifting in the mud, a slow, precise pivot, as if something was listening, assessing. There was no knock, no voice, no shadow, just the subtle compression of mud under immense weight. I wanted to unclip the zipper, to shine my flashlight, to confront it, but every instinct screamed at me to stay still. I lay there, frozen, counting the dragging rhythm in my head. Minutes crawled by, or maybe hours. Time stretched, elongated by fear, by uncertainty. The spacing of the steps was too far for someone exhausted, too deliberate to be random. Then the sound began to retreat. Slowly, step by step, dragging as it went, fading into the storm. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I didn't allow myself to feel relief. Even as the rain slowed to a drizzle with the coming dawn, I stayed put. My body shook, soaked with sweat despite the cold. The forest around me seemed unchanged, but somehow heavier, almost sentient, waiting for me to emerge. When the sun finally bled through the clouds, thin and pale, I forced myself out. Mud clung to my boots, to my pants, making every step an effort. And then I saw them. The footprints. Deep impressions pressed into the trail, almost knee-deep, too large and heavy to be human. They led straight toward my tent, each step dragging like the sound I'd heard hours before. And then, at the entrance, they stopped. No footprints leaving the tent, no trace, no path, nothing. As if the walker had arrived, stood, considered, and simply disappeared. I circled the tent slowly, my boots sinking into the wet earth, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter got stuck in the mud, fell, and vanished. Maybe a feral person lived somewhere in the hills, but nothing matched the evidence. Hunters leave trails. People leave trails. This ended abruptly, right at my tent. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I imagined it, but the evidence was there, undeniable. The forest around me looked normal in the daylight. Birds moved warily, leaves glistened wet and fresh. But I could feel the night pressing in, a memory embedded in every root, every puddle. I couldn't eat, I couldn't focus, I couldn't stop replaying the steps in my mind, counting the drag, imagining the weight behind them. My imagination ran wild. What if it wasn't human? What if it had been something else? Something shaped by the forest, something patient. I stayed in my tent until the sun had fully risen. Then, trembling, I packed up and started back down the trail. Each step was cautious. The mud squished, sucked at my boots, clinging like it wanted to keep me there. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it again, standing silently in the trees just outside the field of vision. But the forest was silent. Too silent. Weeks later, I returned during the day to see the trail properly. The mud had dried, cracked under the sun. The trail looked ordinary, harmless. But I could see it all in my mind. The heavy impressions, the pivot outside my tent, the slow, deliberate dragging. The forest felt heavier somehow, as if it remembered. Trees leaned slightly, shadows fell oddly. I walked slowly, boots crunching over, hardened mud, glancing constantly, imagining every branch snapping, every leaf brushing against some unseen presence. Nothing appeared, but the memory clung to the day like a shadow. I never camped alone in the Appalachians again. I avoid heavy rain, avoid trails like that. Even driving past Norton, I roll up the windows, lock the doors, and keep moving. The forest looks calm, soft, green, inviting, but I know better. I've learned that the forest doesn't need to scream to terrify you. It doesn't need monsters. It can wait. It can watch. And sometimes, if it wants, it will show you something so subtle, so inexplicable, that you will carry it in your mind forever. Even now, when it rains, I hear it sometimes. Not footsteps exactly, but the same wet, dragging rhythm, slow and deliberate. And a part of me knows that if I return to that trail, I might see it again, standing in the rain, silent, observing. Some nights I imagine its weight pressing down on the mud, pivoting slowly, considering me, judging whether I belong in its presence. I've tried rationalizing it countless times. A hunter, a lost hiker, hallucination, exhaustion. Nothing fits. The spacing of the steps, the weight, the stop at my tent, nothing aligns with human behavior. And the absence of any footprints leaving the scene defies logic. Whoever, or whatever, made them had arrived, stood, and disappeared. The ambiguity is the worst part. There's no confrontation, no satisfying closure. A bear, a storm, a falling tree. Those are events you can understand, accept, move on from. This left no answers. It left only a rhythm, a presence, a memory burned into my mind. I can feel it when I walk in the woods, when I hear rain on a trail, when mud clings to my boots. I feel its weight, patient, watching, waiting. I've told this story only to a few people, sparingly. Most dismiss it, some laugh, some look at me as if I've gone mad. I don't need belief, I need the memory. That memory thrives in the sound of rain on a forest path, in the smell of wet pine, in the slow dragging of a heavy weight through mud. I feel it still, an imprint I can't scrub away, a warning that the forest carries secrets, and sometimes its residents, human or otherwise, make their presence known in ways that are subtle, unnerving, and unexplainable. The trail outside Norton remains. Somewhere along it, the forest may be waiting again, watching, listening, judging. I've never returned and probably never will. But every stormy night, every muddy path, every dark forest trail carries a part of that memory. I remember standing there, boots sinking into mud, staring at empty air, imagining the presence just beyond the edge of perception, pondering whether it had been human, feral, or something entirely else. And I know that in some way, it still waits. Even now, years later, storms make my chest tighten. I feel the memory in every drop of rain, in every splash of mud, in every creak of a tree branch. I remember the slow, dragging steps, the pivot outside my tent, the pause that stretched minutes into eternity. I remember the absence that felt like presence, the silence that felt like attention. The forest doesn't need to reveal itself fully. Its patience, its quiet, its unexplainable actions are enough to leave a human mind unmoored. I've carried this memory into everything I do. I avoid mud when I can. I avoid rain. I avoid trails. The Appalachians are beautiful, verdant, inviting, but I know what lurks beneath, in the shadows, in the deep silence. The walker, whatever it was, remains a phantom in my memory. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles a window, I can hear it again. Wet, dragging, patient. Outside my perception, outside my understanding. And I know with that cold certainty that makes your stomach drop, that it could be out there now, waiting for someone else, standing in the mud, pivoting slowly, invisible but present, and I am powerless to stop it. The rain had started mid-afternoon, a constant drizzle that quickly turned into a steady, hammering downpour. By the time I reached the clearing I'd planned to camp in, the ground was nothing but a thick, sodden mess. I'd hiked in with the intention of pitching a tent, but the forest floor squelched under every step, soaking the soles of my boots. Mud clung to everything. My pants, my pack, even my gloves. I cursed under my breath, thinking about turning back, but the forest was dense, the trail I'd followed narrowing until it was little more than a muddy track barely wide enough for my shoulders. I'd hiked hours to get here, and I didn't want to waste it. So I made the decision I'd been reluctant to make. I would sleep in my car. I found a small, flat stretch of land just off the trail where the pines thinned enough for my car to fit without scraping branches. The rain poured harder now, drumming against the roof in a chaotic rhythm that somehow felt like a warning I didn't quite understand. I left the engine running long enough to warm the car's interior, then shut it off, leaving the heater to fade into the humid fog that had begun to curl around every tree, thickening in the valleys and depressions of the forest floor. The world outside my windshield became a blurry, gray smear, fog and rain blending into a single oppressive wall. I tried to settle in, laying across the back seat, using my pack as a pillow, the seatbelt digging into my shoulder. The rhythmic thrum of rain was hypnotic, almost comforting at first, but soon the isolation began to gnaw at me. The forest felt alive in a way that was wrong, not in the cute, rustling leaves kind of way, but in a patient, watching kind of way. I told myself it was just the rain playing tricks with my mind, that I was letting the quiet and the dark do things to me that daylight wouldn't allow. Somewhere around midnight, it started. At first, I thought it was another branch hitting the roof, blown loose by the wind, but the sound was too light, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Light, rhythmic, patient. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The taps came again, slower this time, a gentle but persistent insistence. My heart kicked into a faster rhythm. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something smaller, knocking against the glass as it tried to find shelter from the storm. But even as I repeated it to myself, I knew the sound had a pattern to it that didn't belong to anything natural. The taps were spaced, intentional, as if whoever or whatever was out there was waiting for me to notice. I sat up, my back pressing against the seat. My hand shook as I reached for the dome light. The tap came again, and I saw it. The fog on the rear window had smeared outward, not from the rain or the wind, but as though someone had exhaled slowly against the glass. I leaned closer, straining my eyes, and the shape began to resolve. It was long, almost face-shaped, but stretched unnaturally, like someone leaning too close from a bizarre angle. I blinked, and it was gone. I rubbed at the window with my sleeve, leaving streaks that reflected the dim interior light back at me. My rational mind scrambled. Maybe it was condensation. Maybe the angles of the glass and the fog were playing tricks. I told myself to calm down, that nothing was out there but trees and rain. But then, just a minute later, it appeared again. On the side window this time, inches from where my head had been resting. A long, wet smudge, like the imprint of lips or a face exhaling into the glass. I froze, my chest tightening. There was no breeze in the car, no movement that could explain it. My fingers went numb as I wiped it away, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade. It wrapped around me, pressing in from all sides, the fog outside thickening, the rain's rhythm growing into a heartbeat of its own. I tried to reason it away, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, that exhaustion and isolation were tricking me. I stayed awake for hours, eyes fixed on the windows, listening to the forest. Every small sound was amplified. The snap of a twig, the soft hiss of rain, the occasional whisper of wind through branches. I told myself over and over, it's nothing. It's just the storm. Sleep finally claimed me in short bursts, light dozes where I jolted awake at every imagined movement. And then I heard it again. Not tapping, not smudges this time, but a slow, dragging sound, like fingernails scraping lightly along the roof of the car. I sat up so quickly that my head hit the ceiling. My flashlight, small, handheld, nothing fancy, was on the passenger seat. I grabbed it, shining it across the roof, the back windows, the side mirrors. There was nothing there, just the fog, pressing in from every angle, like the forest itself had leaned close to watch me sleep. I tried to tell myself to leave, to drive away in the middle of the night, but the mud outside was slick, the road barely a trail, and my car would have been stuck in minutes. So I stayed, gripping the wheel, waiting for dawn, counting the hours. When the first light bled through the fog, it was pale and unconvincing, not enough to illuminate the forest fully, just enough to make it feel like the shadows were holding back, watching, waiting. I unlocked the doors slowly, opening the car enough to slip my boots into the mud without stepping fully outside. My pack was soaked, my clothes damp through and through. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, the dense trees, the fog coiling around every trunk. I drove cautiously, mud splattering against the tires, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The car moved slowly, deliberately, and for a few miles, nothing happened. The forest receded behind me, its oppressive presence lifting slightly as I reached a more open stretch of road. My relief was sharp but short-lived. 10 miles down the road, I stopped for gas at a small station that looked like it had been there since the 1970s. The pumps squeaked when I twisted the handle. I tried to shake off the night's experience, telling myself it was a combination of isolation, rain, and exhaustion. That's when I saw it. Streaks on the rear glass. 5 long marks, tracing downward, like fingers had dragged through the condensation while I'd been driving. My stomach turned cold. The car had been moving the entire time. My hands shook as I pressed against the glass, wiping at it frantically. The streaks didn't smear or change. They stayed rigid, unnervingly perfect, as if whatever had made them had been steady, deliberate. I wanted to look behind me, to see if someone was following, but the road was empty. No cars, no footprints, just fog curling low against the asphalt, curling around the tires like it was alive. I didn't see anyone. I didn't see anything. But the feeling, like I had been watched, touched, measured by something unseen, clung to me. I felt exposed, raw, as though the forest itself had marked me. I parked at the station, refusing to drive another mile. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and a permanent scowl, glanced at me as I filled the tank. I wanted to tell him, to explain, but the words felt ridiculous. Somewhere back in the forest, something left its fingers on my car while I was sleeping, I thought, and laughed quietly at myself. But the sound caught in my throat. I didn't say anything. I paid and left as quickly as I could. The rest of the drive was silent, my radio off, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few minutes. The streaks stayed there, stubborn and mocking, 5 fingers dragging down the glass. I tried to tell myself they were marks from my own hands, condensation from my breath, the work of the rain and fog, but deep down I knew it wasn't possible. I hadn't touched that window. I hadn't been outside in the night. Even now, weeks later, I can remember the way the fog wrapped around the car, how the rain sounded like a heartbeat, and the slow, deliberate tapping that started it all. I can remember the way the smudges appeared, always inches from where my head had rested, as if someone, or something, was leaning over me in the dark, patient, unhurried. The thought of it makes my stomach twist, makes my hair rise. I've tried to rationalize it, of course. Maybe it was some clever animal, though what animal exhales against glass in a perfect face shape? Maybe it was my imagination, heightened by isolation, fatigue, and the relentless storm. I even considered that maybe I had brushed the glass myself, half asleep, leaving impressions that my mind transformed into something terrifying. But none of that explains the 5 streaks that trailed down the rear window as I drove through the morning fog. Driving away, I noticed the trees thinning, the sky opening up, and for a brief moment the weight lifted, but not entirely. Even in open country, I felt eyes on me, felt the memory of that patient tapping, the slow smears on the glass. That night, the forest had been alive in a way I hadn't understood until it was too late. It had watched, tested, maybe even mocked me. I never went back to that trail, never attempted to camp in that section of forest again. I avoid dense fog, avoid nights when the rain falls too hard, because I know what's possible out there, in the quiet, in the trees, in the spaces between the sounds of nature. And sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and the fog hangs low over the road, I catch myself glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see long fingers dragging down the glass. I don't think it was human. I don't think it was anything that can be explained easily. And part of me doesn't want it explained. Because there's a weight to the unknown that you carry with you, one that changes the way you move, the way you listen, the way you breathe. The forest doesn't forget. The forest doesn't forgive. And the thing I felt that night, pressing against the windows, patient and still, is still there somewhere, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of falling asleep in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong sky. Even now, the memory of it is sharp. I can feel the cold fog against my skin, hear the tapping against the glass, see the elongated, impossible smudges staring at me from the back window, and I know, with a certainty that chills me, that I wasn't alone that night. I never have been. Some nights, I wake up and see it, in the corner of my vision, a shadow in the fog that wasn't there before. I tell myself it's nothing, that it's just a trick of the light, the play of memory and fear. But the 5 streaks on the rear window were proof. Proof that the forest reaches further than it should, that the woods remember, that the fog remembers. That night, the forest leaned close, and I could feel it breathing. And I still can, every time it rains. I'd been hiking for nearly 8 hours that day, and by the time I reached the creek, I was bone-deep tired, every muscle screaming with exhaustion. The rain had started light that afternoon, barely a mist over the ridges, but the woods had already begun to smell wet and earthy, the kind of smell that sinks into your clothes and hair and seems impossible to shake. I could hear the water before I saw it, the creek roaring over rocks, swollen from days of rain, thicker and darker than the streams marked on the map. It was wide, maybe 15, 20 feet across, moving with a force that made me stop short. My boots were already soaked through, and my pack felt like it weighed twice as much with water sloshing inside. I slumped on a moss-covered rock, trying to catch my breath, trying to think. I considered turning back. I really did. But the idea of retracing my steps through a mud-slicked trail, up and down roots and fallen branches, with the sky already darkening, made my body tremble with a mixture of fatigue and stubbornness. I decided to make camp. I didn't have the energy to find another spot, and the faint outline of a plateau just beyond the bend looked promising. I slid my pack off and started searching for a flat spot above the waterline, somewhere that wouldn't flood if the creek decided to rise further overnight. My fingers were numb, the cold biting through gloves that were already wet, my teeth chattering even under my jacket. The forest seemed unnervingly quiet despite the rain, almost as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Setting up the tent in the pelting rain was like wrestling with a living thing. The wind tugged at the fabric as I hammered in stakes, making the poles bend and creak. I could hear the creek's water lapping and smashing against the rocks below, a constant, rhythmic roar that was almost hypnotic, almost comforting. I tried to settle inside the tent, slipping into my sleeping bag, but the cold didn't leave. Every joint ached. My mind drifted, hazy from exhaustion and damp. I stared at the nylon ceiling, counting the seconds between lightning flashes, listening to the water, watching shadows bend in the dim glow. It was only a storm, I told myself. Only rain and wind. But around midnight, everything changed. I woke to a flash of lightning that felt too close, too sharp, as if it had split the forest open. For a heartbeat, the world outside was laid bare. And there it was, standing in the creek, a figure, tall, rigid, motionless. My heart stuttered like a broken engine. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light. A tree branch caught at a strange angle, but the next flash confirmed it. Human, maybe taller than normal, standing in the middle of the water, letting the current batter its legs without so much as a twitch. Not moving, not wading, just standing. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to close my eyes, to convince myself it was a hallucination, but every part of me was frozen. I could see the outline of its shoulders, the rigid tilt of its head toward me. Each lightning flash brought it slightly closer to my side of the creek. Between flashes, it didn't move. It was as if it existed outside the normal rhythm of the world, anchored in place but slowly advancing in the lightning's memory. My fingers clenched the sleeping bag so tight I thought I'd crush it. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. The storm raged on. Thunder rolled down the ridges. Rain pounded on the tent like a drum, masking the sound of whatever it might have been doing. I stayed awake, heart hammering, watching for flashes. Each time the sky lit up, the figure's presence pressed closer, closer, yet when the light vanished, it froze again. My thoughts scrambled. Could someone really stand in a swollen creek for hours? Could someone survive being soaked, cold, exposed to a storm like that without flinching? And if it was a person, why? Why wait in the middle of a torrent, staring silently through the storm? My mind didn't have answers. I don't know how long it lasted. 15 minutes, an hour. The storm blurred time. But gradually, the rain lessened, the thunder moved away, and the lightning slowed to distant flashes over the ridges. I dared not move until the world outside seemed still, listening for any sound that might indicate it was still there. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I fell into a fitful, half-conscious sleep, always aware of the creek and the possibility of the figure returning. Morning came gray and damp, with mist curling over the forest like smoke. I crawled out of the tent and surveyed the scene. The creek had receded slightly, still angry, but no longer threatening. I tried to rationalize what had happened the night before. Perhaps my mind had conjured it from exhaustion, fear, and the surreal quality of the storm. Maybe it had been a branch, a trick of shadows, some natural feature amplified by my weariness. I shook myself, telling myself that it wasn't real. Then I saw the prints. Heavy, deep impressions in the mud, pressed flat as if someone had deliberately planted their weight. At first, I thought maybe the water had washed out old marks, or maybe it was a trick of the angle. But I stared longer. Every print pointed directly at my tent. Not across the creek, not upstream or downstream, directly at me. And they stopped at the water's edge. They didn't trail back, didn't lead away. They ended as if whoever, or whatever, stood there the whole storm, waiting, and had left nothing else behind. I wanted to run, to laugh at myself for imagining the figure had moved, but the sight of those prints nailed me to the ground. I kept replaying the flashes of lightning in my mind, imagining the figure frozen in the creek, watching, letting the water batter it for hours without moving. And then I imagined the prints forming, each one deliberate, each one pointing, toward me like a warning, like a declaration. My stomach knotted and a cold realization settled over me. It hadn't needed to move. The figure's stillness, its waiting, was the point. That was the horror. Not what it did, but the impossibility of it simply being. I packed up my tent quickly, hands trembling, boots slipping in the mud. Every sound, the creek, the wind shaking the trees, a bird calling in the distance, felt amplified, as if the forest were alive and watching. I glanced back over my shoulder, irrationally expecting to see movement in the water, some confirmation that it hadn't been my imagination. But the creek was empty, calm now, and the prints remained, a frozen record of presence that defied logic. The hike back felt longer than it should have. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Shadows flickered where there should have been sunlight. The mist clung to the underbrush, curling around roots and rocks like tendrils. Every snap of a branch made my stomach leap. I wanted to be anywhere but there, and yet I had to pass that creek again, had to confront the fact that the prints hadn't moved, hadn't crossed, hadn't changed. I couldn't explain them. I still can't. I eventually made it back to a main trail, a route more traveled, where people leave trash and chatter and cell service. I told myself that I was safe now, that the forest had released me, and yet the memory of standing there, staring across a torrent at something impossibly still, haunted me. I started hiking shorter distances, avoiding creeks and swamps, avoiding anything that could remind me of that night. I tried not to think about the prints, the stillness, the cold and waiting in the water. Even now, years later, I hear water over rocks in the middle of a storm and flinch. Lightning flashes make me pause, make me remember the figure standing there, inching closer with every strike, and the prints pointing at me, ending without explanation. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I've seen it in the corner of the room, waiting. And I realize that what frightened me most wasn't the figure itself, but the certainty that it had watched, had waited, had left its mark without moving. It didn't need to chase me, didn't need to make a sound, didn't even need to cross the creek. It simply existed in a way I could never reconcile. I sometimes replay that night in my mind, walking through the forest again, imagining every step, every detail. The smell of wet leaves, the cold water, the rhythm of rain on rocks. I try to rationalize it as a human, but the image won't allow it. Standing in that torrent, unwavering, unyielding. And the prints, heavy, deliberate, pointing toward me, ending at the edge, waiting. They defy reason, they defy understanding, and somehow they're a part of me now. I don't hike alone anymore. I avoid any place that could resemble that creek, that plateau, that stretch of forest where I first saw it. I don't talk about it because people wouldn't understand. They'd laugh, or shake their heads, or suggest exhaustion, hallucination, paranoia. But I know what I saw. I know the prints, and I know that some part of the forest, some part of that night is still waiting, watching, frozen in place, pointing. The thought that haunts me most, even now, is not of danger, not of attack, not of violence. It's the stillness, the patience, the certainty. Standing in that swollen creek exposed to the storm, letting the water tear at it without flinching, waiting. And the prints that followed, ending at me, a record of observation, not movement. A quiet, impossible presence that the world cannot explain. Sometimes, when I hear heavy rain outside my window, I imagine it's out there again, standing in some creek somewhere, tall, still, and waiting. And I can't help but wonder if one day I'll see the prince again, or worse, if it has already returned and I just haven't realized it yet. The forest was silent that night, but I know it wasn't empty. And I know that the figure didn't leave. It couldn't. Not really. Not in the way that matters. It simply exists, waiting, watching, pointing,